It has one of the toughest and longest lockdowns in the world. But the ultra-strict quarantine measures have left more than 5 million Filipinos hungry.
Sobrang sakit po. Siyempre po, parang nakakaya rin yun, yung nagpupulit ng gulay. Siyempre mas unahin mong makakain ka kaysa mayayaya ka pa.
More than 10 million people have lost their jobs and their livelihoods destroyed.
Ako din mismo kahit nagtatanong ako, 5 buwan na, bakit wala pa rin ba kumbaga, tawag doon? Wala pa rin linaw na sagot diyan sa sa epidemyang 'yan.
Why did the pandemic hit the poorest of the poor so hard?
When a crisis like this hits an unequal society like the Philippines, it's like amplifying the inequality and the social divide. So the poor are bearing the brunt of unequal distribution of the impacts of this crisis.
As the Philippine economy is crashing into its worst recession in decades, how can the country's poor pull themselves out of the crushing poverty?
Minsan naiyak ako dyan, kung lang mag-isa. Minsan naisipan ko nga magbigay ako, yun o kaya.
Manila, the capital city of the Philippines, a business hub plagued by economic disparity. As the city progresses, 35% of its population, or more than 4 million, still reside in slums. They are laborers who have to contend with meager incomes of less than $2 a day.
Napakahalaga na makilala natin sino ba talaga nagpapatakbo nito at bakit yung bumubuo at nagpapatakbo ng lungsod nananatili sila sa kahirapan, no? Hindi nila natatamasa yung yaman na pinapakita, no, o yung pinoproject ng lungsod.
And now Manila has become the new epicenter for the coronavirus outbreak in Southeast Asia, with slums considered as viral hotbeds for the transmission of the disease.
Space is a luxury for the rich. So the poor, they live in small homes, in crowded, congested communities. The vulnerability, of course, with any sort of infectious disease, it's the enclosed space, the close interaction, the amount of people you're interacting with. The poor really have it worse in the normal time. They also have it worse, I think, in times of crisis right now.
But the country's urban poor is facing a fear far more frightening than COVID, the fear of starvation.
Hindi kami natakot mamatay sa COVID. Takot kami na mamatay sa gutom.
As work and incomes dry up, starvation is forcing the urban poor to cope in unthinkable ways. Midnight at one of Manila's biggest slums. 64-year-old Bernadette Sablazar and her neighbor Elena Perena, together with Elena's 16-year-old daughter Leia, breach quarantine restrictions in search of food.
Lang nakakagamot doon sa gutom, patay ka.
As an elderly, Bernadette is required to stay at home. And like her, teenage Leia is also not allowed to be outside of her residence. Yet in spite of all the restrictions, they're venturing out during curfew hours and risk being caught. But they're too hungry to care for rules.
Di po di ako nakakaranas ng gutom. Ngayon po nararanasan ko na. Minsan, pagigising po ako, wala pong pagkain. Kapag wala ka pong pagkain, hindi ka po pa nakakakain. Tatama rin ka kumilos, kumbaga lumpapay ka na lang, parang nanginginig ka na lang sa gutom nung hindi ka na magsasalita. Tapos pag nagugutom po ako, wala pong nagbibigay sa akin kasi po walang pera.
Hungry and desperate, they're braving their way to Divisoria, Manila's largest public market, to scavenge for vegetable scrap or collect leftover goods freely handed out by generous sellers.
Sa panahon ngayon ang hirap at parang takot pa kaming lumabas dahil sa uhulihin ka ng pulis ko. Pag sinita ako ng pulis, saan ka pupunta? Sabi ko, mamumulot ako ng gulay dahil yun lang yung tanging kahit paano makatulong sa pamilya ko na madagdag raos, gutom.
The lockdown has crippled Elena and Bernadette's ability to work and earn an income. Bernadette is an egg seller who used to earn $15 a day. Elena is a freelance massage therapist who could earn up to $30 on good days. She was doing well enough to even put up a small store to help with the family's daily spend. But everything just fell apart during the first week of the lockdown. Elena's family was forced to consume every food stock they had in their small store.
Kapag hindi sila nagtrabaho, wala sila makakain. Yung urban poor, halos wala nga yung konsepto ng weekend kasi kahit weekend, kailangan nilang dumiskarte, kailangan nilang rumakit. No? At kahit nga wala silang trabaho, hahanap yan ng paraan para makadiskarte ng pera sa paglalaba, sa informal work, may iba't ibang informal work, pedicab, etc.
Hindi kami sanay na magpalimos sa ating pamahalaan. Sanay kaming maghanap buhay. Pero sa panahon ngayon, nawala na sa amin yun. Hindi kami makapaghanap buhay.
The crisis has significantly damaged the asset base of urban poor. Street vendors couldn't sell on the streets. Jeepney drivers, pedicab drivers, tricycle drivers couldn't operate, couldn't go out and pick up passengers. So it would be very difficult for them to recover economically from this crisis.
Like Bernadette and Elena, many Filipinos experienced hunger amid the lockdown. In fact, the Philippines' hunger incidence rate is at its highest in 6 years, according to the Social Weather Station, a non-profit research institution. The poll reveals that 20.9% or 5.2 million Filipino families have experienced involuntary hunger at least one in the past 3 months of the quarantine period.
Sobrang sakit po. Siyempre po, parang nakakayari yun, yung napupulit ng gulay. Siyempre, mas unahin mong makakain ka kaysa mayayaya ka pa.
After 4 hours, Elena, Bernadette and Leah have collected more than enough to tide them through the next 2 days and are planning on giving their extras around their neighborhood.
Doon sa ibang lugar, medyo ramdaman mo rin talaga kasi dumadaing din sila sa amin, humihingi din sila ng kahit papano, humihingi sila sa amin, may mga dumadating kaming ayuda, kahit papano. Ramdaman namin, dati naman hindi nila ginagawa yun na manghingi sa amin, pero sa ngayon talaga, nangihingi sila.
The Philippine government has come in with aid to help mitigate the problem of hunger among the people. A week after announcing its quarantine measures, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte signed into law a package of emergency cash subsidy to 18 million low-income families. Beneficiaries will receive at least $100 to a maximum of $165 each month for 2 months. City governments and village leaders were given a month to distribute the aid, and aid had to reach swiftly. But many, like Elena, didn't receive her subsidy right away, even after waiting for more than a month.
Pag wala, mangutang talaga ako. Mapipilitan ako mangutang. Kailangan eh. Hindi ko naman pabayaan.
Pag nagkaroon naman po kami, lahat po ng utang namin, babayaran po namin. Mas importante po, nakakakain kami. Kahit marami kaming utang, basta nakakakain kami.
Elena borrowed just enough money to purchase rice.
Bawat saing ko ay 1 kilo. Noon, pwede pa ako magsaing na umaga. Ay ngayon dahil crisis na, 2 beses na lang ako nagsasaing. Ano na lang sa umaga, kape na lang muna. Diretso na lang tanghalian. So, malaking diferensya.
If not for these loans, as well as Elena's risky venture to the market earlier today, her family could have fallen very ill, or worse, die of starvation.
Nakakasanay gutom sa toyo at saka kanin. Asin or ano man, ayun, basta maano lang yung gutom. Iiyakan ka talaga kapag gutom. Alam mo mga bata, minsan napapalo mo na lang kapag wala ka talaga, kaya pipilitin ka kung wala.
Minsan kapag kakain kami ng asin, nung titignan niya na lang kami, yung asin na lang ulam namin. Kahit po asin lang yung ulam namin, baka iniisip ni mama na hindi niya kaya ibigay lahat ng kung yung anong gusto namin ulam, anong gusto namin, ayun lang nabibigay niya kasi po lockdown. Pero kahit asin lang, okay lang sa amin, is nakakakain kami.
The poor are battling hunger and a crippling lockdown. Is the government doing enough to alleviate their pain? Will help come in time before the situation spirals out of control? Soon after announcing a nationwide lockdown, President Rodrigo Duterte signed into law the Social Amelioration Program, or SAP. Under the SAP, the government provides 18 million low-income families with a much-needed emergency cash subsidy. Each beneficiary will receive at least $100 each month for 2 months. City governments and village leaders were given a month to distribute the aid. The distribution had to be swift, so that aid gets to the more vulnerable segments of the population. As an urban poor, Elena Perena qualifies as a beneficiary for the Social Amelioration Program. She was expecting to receive the promised first month cash subsidy immediately, but help didn't come along until 2 months after. Aid was not only slow, but it was also very little. Elena received only $138 on her first month of subsidy, equivalent to about 4 days of her usual daily income.
Siguro may 1 linggo lang sa akin yun. Kasi binawas na, pinambayad na, tapos panggastos. Taglit lang, di ba? Eh kung noon yun, medyo masapat pa yung kita, wala pa yung 1 linggo, ubos na.
The emergency cash subsidy is only about a quarter of what a family of 5 actually needs in a month to get by, based on current estimates by economists and urban poor advocates.
Well, the thing is, the subsidy was not meant to be like a cure-all. It was just meant to be a partial subsidy. So, and we have to recognize also that government has its own constraints. They don't have infinite money.
Elena's problem is even more dire. That's because she has 10 children and 13 grandchildren living under the same roof. Except for one, all of them don't earn an income after their employers had temporarily ceased their businesses. The government claims it has nothing left to extend its subsidies. But the harsher reality is Elena's family are much better off than most. Other families had waited for far much longer to receive their first month emergency cash subsidies. 3 months into the lockdown, 5 million families are still wondering if their aid is ever going to come.
The majority waited so long, and also the tranche they got was next to nothing. It was equivalent to about 9 pesos per person per day over the last 5 months. You can't do anything with that.
A huge cause of delay, a random distribution of aid.
We've heard a lot about irregularities in the distribution. Some local officials were prioritizing their own relatives, their own probably friends. They would prioritize their friends because we have a very weak democratic system that hardly works in some areas. And that of course affects the poor who are supposedly benefiting fairly from the distribution, but some of them were not able to receive this assistance because they were not part of that patron-client system in their area.
Under the law, an irregularity like this is a criminal offence. On the second month of the lockdown, the national government received more than 2,000 complaints against village council officials for the delay in the distribution of aid. Currently, the Philippine Prosecutor's Office have charged 134 officials with various graft-related cases. 50 officers are now suspended from office. But the crux of the matter is, local governments are also facing systemic problems. The Philippines has barely begun transitioning to a national ID system, though a newly created law mandates it. That's why city governments had to rely on an outdated list of their constituents based on a national census that was held 5 years ago. As a result, many Filipinos have been excluded.
During the pandemic, even if we wanted to have universal cash transfers, we couldn't because there was no mechanism. There was no way for us to locate everybody.
Now, nearly 6 months after announcing provisions for emergency cash subsidies, the government has given the second month subsidy to almost 95% of beneficiaries.
The original sin with the social amelioration program is that the government was so stingy about it. Parang napilitan lang sila. You did not get a sense that they wanted to help as many people as quickly as possible.
Elena is unsure if her second month subsidy is coming. In the meantime, Elena's debts are piling up. She currently owes about $100 from friends, on top of utility bills she has to pay.
Sa loob ng 4 na buwan, nagiging 16,000 yung bill ko. O paano ko pa mababayaran yan? Hindi pa puputol ko na lang yan.
Elena's family has also become too poor to protect themselves against COVID-19.
Minsan po kapag ganun, di ba kunyari, isa lang yung maskotes lalabahan ko. Tapos pag sinampay ko po, gagamitin po ng isa kong kapatid. Tapos mawawalan po ako ng mask. Minsan po kapag lalabas po ako, parang pinakabahan po ako kasi puso yung virus.
The Philippines is known to have one of the most restrictive lockdowns in the world. A special pass was needed to move around to buy essential goods. Those who violate the curfew and social distancing measures or fail to wear a mask will be punished. They range from fines to detention. Mass gatherings like protests are banned. But on the third week of the lockdown, 100 Filipinos gathered at EDSA, a main thoroughfare where historic protests happen. 64-year-old Cesar Galamoza was one of them.
May nagsabi na yung mga parang haka-haka ba, yung storya na, bukas sumama ka. Bakit ako? Sabi ko gano'n. Para makaano tayo ng kalahating kaban. May na mamimigay daw bukas.
As an elderly, he's not allowed outside of his residence. But Cesar is desperate. He lives from paycheck to paycheck after he lost his blue-collar job.
Minsan, lulugaw-lugaw lang mo naman para medyo makatipid-tipid eh. Napantay pa tayo. At least malagyan lang ng sikmura na makalam na. Yung mga bata, na namin na makakain sila ng maayos. O yung una pa, naggagatas pa kasi.
Penniless and famished, Cesar decided to join his neighbors at EDSA. He arrived at 9 in the morning. There was no relief distribution in sight.
Marami na pong mga tao nag-aabang. Iba, hindi na nga tinupad yung wala na sa isip yung social distance. Yung iba, walang mga mask. Yung iba, mayroon. Ako, may mask din po ako noon. Yung panahon na yun, oras na yun.
Later, a team of police arrived to disperse the crowd. Driven into a corner, time and options are running out for the urban poor. Will the government be able to deliver a solution? Or will anger spill out into the streets? Three weeks into the Philippine lockdown, a commotion over food aid erupted at EDSA, one of Manila's main thoroughfares. A day before the incident, rumors spread across the slum village of San Roque that a sack of rice would be given out as aid at EDSA. Although mass gatherings are banned, about 300 people turned up the following day. Soon, the police arrived and advised them to disperse. But driven by desperation, 64-year-old Cesar Villamosa stayed on.
Pero ako, nagtiyaga pa rin ako. Kasi sabi nung wag muna kayo umuwi. Dahil may darating nga daw na truck na may karga ng yung pamimigay na tulong. Kalating sako o yung mga goods, mga relief, ganyan. Hindi ako naniwala naman ko, hindi antay-antay ako.
The pandemic really put a strain on the poor. They are already the most vulnerable. They put a strain on the poor because absolutely, poor would not want to get sick. As much as possible, they don't want to be sick because they know it's going to cost money. They know it's going to stop them from working. The poor do not want to get sick, but they will risk life and limb if they're not going to be able to feed themselves.
So, yung ganitong klaseng, kahit chismis lang, kahit hindi confirmed, talagang dadagsain siya ng mga tao kasi gutom na sila eh. So, pagdating doon at wala talaga nadatnan, naghintay sila at yung iba, nagkaroon na ng panawagan. No? So, yung iba, kumuha na rin talaga ng mga papel, no? Kartolina nga yata, no? Sinulat nila na gutom na kami, ganyan, ibigay na ninyo yung ayuda, etc. No? Tas doon na nagsimula itong hulihan na ginawa ng PNP.
Dumating na yung malaking truck na may mga pulis, yung nanguhuli sa mga rally, ganyan. Eh, kala nila rally yung pinunta namin, hindi naman eh. Pagkain yung hinihingi namin, hindi rally. Sabi kong ganun. Nandyan na. No, inahabol na kami. Ay, ako, patakbo na sana ako. Malapit na ako doon sa yung iskinita na daanan namin pauwi na.
That's how Cesar ended up in detention for 5 days. Together with 20 others, they were charged with 5 cases allegedly in violation of quarantine rules and health emergencies. These offences could have put them in detention for 6 months. In the Philippines, violations are quite commonplace. Since the lockdown was implemented in mid-March, more than 300,000 quarantine violators were apprehended by authorities. Violators were warned, fined, detained, or charged. Most of these violators come from impoverished families.
Pag kayo ang na-detain, bahala kayo sa pagkain ninyo.
The night of the commotion, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte addressed the country about the incident. He suspected that leftist insurgents were behind it and promised to act tough against the rumor-mongers.
Huwag ninyo akong takutin ng gulo-gulo. Kasi kung gusto talaga ninyo ng gulo, guguluhin natin ang bayan natin. Total, wala pa naman pagkain. Kung gusto ninyo barilan, di sige.
But politics are pointless to those barely surviving.
Pero sabihin nyo na lang kung ako man nasa posisyon nyo, kami sa posisyon namin, ano mang gagawin nyo? Mahirap na palang gawin yung ganun. Babaliin mo yung inuutos ng gobyerno, huwag mo sawayin. Paano naman kami? Mamamatay kami sa gutom, ganyan.
There is no understanding. There is no social consideration. There is no value being given to the life that is supposed to be saved. That is the most difficult part for me to understand. You enforce a quarantine because you want to save lives. You want to save lives by stopping the spread of disease. And yet here we are. Here is the government having very little consideration for that life. It just goes against the very grain of our humanity.
Caesar and the other 20 detainees are now out on bail, paid for by 2 influential celebrities. It cost more than $6,400 to release them, an amount they could not have raised by themselves. Fortunately, they also received free legal assistance. If not for these, Caesar and his family would have no choice but to accept the punishment. But Caesar continues to confront his worsening poverty day by day. Nearly 6 months into the lockdown, he and his daughter are still waiting for a job. He also faces a pile of debts and the prospect of eviction from his rented home, even as they're trying to cope with the problem of starvation.
Buti pa yun, wala man lang ID. Kasi ang gusto nga namin, uwi na lang kami ng probinsya pagkatapos tong kaso namin eh. Kahit papaano doon, walang maniningil sa iyo ng paupa ng bahay. At least tubig, yung kuryente, kahit na walang kuryente doon, ano na lang, yung gasira na lang, okay na yun.
Ironically, many urban poor come to Manila in search of a better life, away from rural poverty. But even in the city, life has been a constant struggle. COVID-19 has threatened to displace nearly 11 million workers from the informal sectors and erase years of progress on poverty alleviation. The truth is, there are not enough policies and mechanisms to help pull the poor out of their poverty trap.
Nasa cycle sila ng kahirapan kasi structurally, systemically, napapanatili silang gano'n. So lahat ng ito, systemically, hindi talaga sila makakaangat sa buhay nila, kahit pa magsikap ka na magsikap ng magsikap. Kasi wala silang paraan para magkaroon ng advantage pagdating sa buhay.
But also I think because people are seeing how unequal the Philippines is and how problematic our politics is, I think we are in the middle of a moment. People are actually asking, is this the government we deserve? Are these economic policies we need? Why are people so bad off?
The Philippines has been fighting chronic poverty since the late 1960s. For decades, the nation had always been dubbed as the sick man of Asia. But a series of economic reforms in early 2000 paved the way for growth. from opening country-to-country international trade, foreign direct investments like business process outsourcing, as well as hospitality and tourism. In 2013, the Philippine economy finally gained strength. The World Bank described the Philippines as Asia's rising tiger. With its GDP rising steadily, the Philippines was no longer the sick man of Asia, but a breakout nation with one of the most promising economies in the world. Philippine poverty rates were finally going down, but it was just numbers.
These income indicators actually, one, don't fail to capture so many other dimensions of poverty. But secondly, and I think it's the worst thing for us, it's actually used to hide high levels of poverty. We have the richest 50 Filipinos having a combined wealth of 4.1 trillion pesos, which is equivalent to the combined wealth of the poorest 60 to 70 million Filipinos. That doesn't make sense.
A clear evidence of uneven, exclusionary growth is right in the slums. The urban poor have been struggling to own homes. In the last 10 years, Caesar's informal settlement has been defying eviction and demolition. About 6,000 families live on this government-owned property. But a part of this real estate has been sold to a private developer with no plan of resettling its slum dwellers.
Pangunahin siguro na pinaglalaban ng mga urban poor ay yung pabahay, no. Hindi ka rin naman kasi makakagalaw sa loob ng lungsod kung wala kang titirhan, no. At nakita natin na parang napakarami din talaga ng informal settler families dito sa loob ng lungsod, no. At bakit ganon? Kasi walang pinoprovide na pabahay sa kanila yung pamahalaan, no. At wala din naman silang capacity para bumili ng sariling bahay o mangupahan doon sa mga area na napakataas ng upa.
So while GDPs have been rising, job opportunities and better labor conditions among the urban poor are barely improving. Many of the urban poor remain as workers in the informal economy, as drivers of jeepneys and rickshaws, street peddlers, owners of small convenience stores, or manual laborers in the construction industry. Statisticians and economists estimate that at least 62% of Filipinos are working in the informal economy. That's about 30 million informal workers suffering through decades of income inequality.
You also have a lot of workers who don't have legal protection of the law, but they are still there. The street vendors, the tricycle drivers, the barkers of jeepneys. They are workers, they are contributing to the economy, but they are not part of the mantle of legal environment.
It's no wonder the urban poor like Elena, Bernadette, and Caesar are the most vulnerable during the pandemic. The urban poor, like them, already had it worst before COVID-19 as mere daily wage earners without safety nets and social protection.
I'm still calling this pandemic as, in a way, a form of slow-moving disaster. Why? Because disasters or crises don't exist in a vacuum. In the case of the Philippines, we have very weak democratic institutions. And for us to be able to manage this, well, to begin with, this has reached this level, this unprecedented level, because I think it was poorly managed from the start.
The Philippine government wants to recover from the pandemic by providing corporate tax breaks and loans to SMEs. But so far, they've been silent on how to help the urban poor in the informal sector. Or perhaps there is really none at all. Now the urban poor are resorting to self-help, while a new sector is plunging into poverty. But how much can they do to solve their financial and health woes? In Manila, Philippines, the urban poor are left on their own to survive through the pandemic. In San Roque, an informal settlement with roughly 30,000 residents, many have been jobless throughout the 6-month-long quarantine. In place of their jobs, the city government helped to distribute rice to local residents.
Kulang na kulang yung bigay nila. Kahit sabihin nagbibigay sila ng walang ano. Kahit nga nung panahon ng lockdown, bali 3 beses lang kami nakatanggap ng tigli 5 kilong bigas dito eh.
To solve hunger in their community, FEARSIDCO decided to help in a community kitchen. The non-profit organizations helped to raise funds to kickstart this initiative. They established 28 community kitchens throughout San Roque, providing breakfast to 3,000 residents.
Kasi meron kang pandemya, di ba? At kailangan maging malusog yung mga tao. Hindi sila magiging malusog kung puro delata yung ipapakain mo sa kanila.
Aside from this kitchen, the non-profit organizations helped pull together community health volunteers, like Gelin Rossilo. As most of them are undereducated, volunteer doctors taught them about how to respond to the threat of COVID-19 infections and what they can do to avoid falling ill. But they have a more important task. Volunteers like Gelin look out for COVID-19 symptoms around the neighborhood and deliver food to those under quarantine. In closed and congested places where COVID virus would most likely thrive, mass testing at San Roque hasn't even begun. The residents also claim that government healthcare workers avoided their slum community. They've been told that government frontliners lack personal protective equipment, or PPE, too. That's why most residents feared for their lives.
Noong kasagsagan talaga ng COVID na yun, takot yung mga tao lumabas. O kahit na may mga relief dyan na nagka-dikit-dikit sila, takot yung mga tao mahawaan talaga eh.
So, from the point of view of individual vulnerability, the poor is already vulnerable. Their immune system is low. They're not eating the food that they need to survive, and they don't have the rest.
Mandatory precautionary measures like safe distancing, hand washing, hand sanitation, and mask wearing are luxuries for slum dwellers.
50, 60, 75, ganun na ang mahal. Hindi yan afford ng mga maralita eh. Kumbaga, mag-issue sila sa lahat ng mga maralita, lahat ng mga squad, bigyan nila ng pang-1 buwan o pang-1 taon yan kung kailan man gagamitin, kung hanggang kailan ang pandemyang ito. Kung i-required to ang disposable mask na to, ibigay nila. Pag 1 taon, pag 2 taon, bigay nila ng libre. Hindi yung pahirapan kami na bibili-bili kami.
So Gelin relied on private donations to assist her community. But nearly 6 months into quarantine, help has stopped coming.
Ngayon, pag nangingi sila, tapos sabihin namin na wala, na parang, parang kumikirot sa dibdib mo. Kasi dati nagawa namin, bakit ngayon hindi na? Minsan parang hindi na lang ako pumupunta kasi parang pag may nagsabi sa'yo, wala kang maibigay, parang sakit sa loob. Gusto mo sanang gawin, pero walang-wala ka rin eh. Di ba?
Back in the community kitchens, funds are also running out. No new pledges have come in. Shalita's community kitchen used to feed 75 people 5 times a week. Now they are down to 35, twice a week.
Kasi ang namin, bali tinapos na lang namin yung bigas na sa center po. Yun, bali naman kami ng yung tawag yan, yung merienda, sopas.
This week's feeding will actually be the last. Hungry as she may be, Shalita had not been eating from meals they'd prepared. That's because she feels others need the food more than her.
Kagaya yung may sa akin, Nanay Iying, pahingi naman ako dyan ng pambili lang ng almusal. bibigyan ko din siya kasi siyempre pangkain nga niya.
But community volunteers like Faye is not giving up. She decided to grow vegetables on her backyard to be a food source whenever someone asks for help.
At the end of the day, if these community kitchens dry up and we stop providing food, the government has to come in. At the end of the day, it's their responsibility to provide relief and to help the struggling urban poor in their own vicinity, in their own city. So if the government is not part of that, it's like you are exonerating the state from its responsibility to provide the needed assistance, especially of the urban poor.
Ako din mismo kahit nagtatanong ako, 5 buwan na, bakit wala pa rin ba kumbaga, tawag doon, wala pa rin linaw na sagot dyan sa sa epidemyang yan.
Unlike Shalita, there's only so much that Gelin can do to protect herself. If she gets infected with COVID-19, she will not receive any free treatment. The national government extends help to those who contribute to a state health insurance. But Gelin is too poor to make the voluntary contributions.
Natatakot din ako kasi hindi ko alam yan kung saan kumakapit yung virus. Baka mamaya madala ko sa kanila. Tapos magkaroon ako yung nagbigay ng sakit sa mga anak ko. Kaya takot pero pinilit ko yan kinakaya.
As many of the urban poor struggle on their own through the community quarantine, another sector of society is increasingly desperate. Jeepney drivers are resorting to begging or protesting to go back to work. Jeepneys are the most popular transportation in the Philippines. It's known for its crowded seating, so the government allows less than 5% of jeepneys to ply through the roads as a containment measure.
Well, if we're looking at their numbers, there's more than, I think, 170,000 jeepney units nationwide. So you're talking about 170,000 families nationwide relying on the jeepney industry. So you multiply that by 5 or 6 members. So we're talking about close to 1 million people relying on the jeepney industry alone. And if we're not serious with listening to their demand or at least heeding their appeal, then it's like you're basically ignoring one section of your population.
Now, in just 6 months, jeepney drivers have fallen into poverty. Chito Bustamante had been driving a jeep for more than a decade to save up for his dream home.
Mga pangarap ko sana matapos ko, makabili kami ng sariling bahay. Yung pinag-usapan namin ng asawa ko eh. Kaya kumuha ako hulog boundary na jeep. Tapos, sabi nila, di na makabiyahe yung jeep. Eh, paano na nga ako? Wala pa akong sariling bahay. Yung inaano ko eh.
Now, he is not only out of work, Chito has also no house to live in.
Eh, baka may mga kami, mga bago kayo, tapos bili ka palayasin. Tapos pilitin ka pa pabayarin na wala man biyahe yung jeep.
Meanwhile, Honorario Borromeo had to rely on loan sharks to help supplement his unstable income and send his 7 children to school.
Napakahirap po ng buhay ng maging jeepney driver. Andiyan na po yung maraming risk na kinakaharap namin. Pangkalusugan, yun po yung hindi stable na income, merong off, may on. So iyon po yung mga ayaw ko nang maranasan ng mga anak ko na naranasan ko na.
19-year-old Trisha is Honorario's eldest daughter, who has a year left before finishing her engineering degree. All she wants is to graduate from a university, be gainfully employed, and help her father, Honorario, in sending her siblings to school.
Kaya habang kaya pa po ni Papa, nag-aaral po kami ng mabuti para hindi po masayang yung pagod ni Papa.
Adding to their worries is a contentious government plan to phase out jeepneys. They require jeepney owners like Honorario and Chito to upgrade to environmentally friendly vehicles. But it's an investment they cannot afford. They're still paying loans for the current jeepneys they own. The government hasn't extended assistance to jeepney drivers like Chito and Honorario, except for emergency cash subsidies. It's also unclear if they will ever get back on the roads, even when COVID-19 is over.
We know at the end of the day, jeepney drivers will be displaced. We do agree there is a need to modernize jeepneys, but there's a way to modernize jeepneys without leaving the poor and vulnerable drivers behind. Again, it involves the government subsidizing the transition. And that's the basic demand of jeepney drivers.
Amidst these uncertainties, Honorario's children suffer the most. Trisha's dreams are put on hold, as Honorario was forced by circumstances to drop his children out of school.
Naiiyak po kasi syempre po yung unang-una po lahat naman po ng ng mga bata na tulad ko po. Pangarap po natin na makapag-aral po kahit po sana ngayon po sa pandemic. Gusto po natin mag-aral kaya lang po andun nga po tayo sa sitwasyon na medyo hindi po natin kaya.
Honorario's family now sells native delicacies to enable the family to eat 3 times a day, while Chito has to find other ways to put food on the table. The only recourse is to scavenge for junk.
Minsan tinitingnan nila ako. Pag nangalakal ako, minsan iniwasan nila ako. Akala siguro totoo talaga na ako. Na talagang doon ako nabuhay sa kalakal, di na alam na driver ako. Kasi madungis na ako eh. Iba na yung suot ko eh. Sinilas ko, wala na yung dito, wala na, butas-butas. Doon
While strangers fear him, Chito actually has fears too. He worries about getting infected from the junk he collects.
Natakot ako din doon. Kasi yun nga sa sakit ng COVID, hindi ko alam kung saan kalaban natin ito. Buti sa kung nakikita natin sa isip ko. Hindi natin nakikita, mahirap.
For this morning, he traded the stash he's collected for $1.50. It's enough to buy him a kilo of rice.
Wala na rin pag-asa kung makabili ng bahay. Isa pa yung nakapalang wala na pag-asa talaga. Kasi naiyak ako dyan, kung lang mag-isa. Kasi naisipan ko may bigti ako, yun kaya.
The government isn't doing enough. That's why they're so dismissive. Because they know the Filipino poor have suffered so much through all the years. They will survive. It's not a question of them recovering. Even if pushed to the ground, they will try their best to make do with what they have.
Poverty is a vicious cycle, a self-perpetuating condition that can't simply be broken without external help. Caught in a daily struggle for survival, before the pandemic, that challenge was almost insurmountable. But a crippling lockdown brought on by COVID-19 has turned that challenge into a huge battle against hunger and hopelessness. How long can the poor hold on to hope before starvation takes over? How long more shall they wait before their cries for help give way into silence?